Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're doing a very topical subject. What is disease? Now, one of the central questions of the philosophy of medicine is what defines a disease. Note that when philosophers use the term disease, they mean very literally something that causes you dis-ease. They mean to capture most things about which one might seek advice from a medical professional, including things like infections, but also genetic conditions and psychological conditions, but not something like pregnancy, which is why we can't just define disease as some reason that you might go to seek a medical professional's advice. But we're talking about disease in the broad sense, not in terms of the kind of bacteria versus virus sense. That's something that philosophy of medicine pushes on to actual scientists and medical professionals. Now, it has been argued that disease is both a descriptive and an evaluative term, in that it both describes a condition, but also prescribes action, that one should seek to make the condition better. So what we're saying here is that when you say something is a disease, you're not simply describing a feature of the world, you're saying that you, person, have a disease and should do something about that. And because of that, it has some interesting properties. So, there are two broad camps on how to define the term disease. The first is the disease naturalists, also called descriptivists or objectivists. We're going to cover them first, and then we'll look at the normativists in the second half. For naturalists, disease can be defined in reference solely to their underlying biological features and symptoms. For the naturalist, diseases are biological states or environmental conditions that impair normal functioning. So, a lot is going to ride on what we mean by normal functioning, and different versions of naturalists may categorize certain things. They may include only biological diseases or include psychological diseases as well, all of these things. In this, we're just going to try to kind of look at the broad scope of generally what are naturalists saying. So it should be clear that this definition of disease relies on a strong definition of what constitutes normal function. If we can't define normal function, it's unclear which particular processes constitute impeding or inhibiting normal function. First, this only has meaning with reference to a particular demographic of a particular organism. So, with respect to, for example, humans, you might have age and gender be the demographics that you care about. So, what's normal functioning for a Venus flytrap is abnormal functioning for a human or a dog. So you need to define your terms strictly enough to be able to actually give some importantly interesting definition of normal functioning. However, given the biological diversity, even within one of these categories, there's a challenge in finding what would constitute kind of normal. The naturalists avoid this concern through reference to the functions that are statistically typical to the survival and reproduction of the individual. So, what are the most common characteristics in a population? Sure, there may be a few people that have this rare genetic disease, but because it is rare and not the norm statistically, those people are not considered to be normal functioning, whereas the people that fit the norm are considered to be more normal functioning. In other words, what's the most common way that a particular type of organ contributes to the survival for organisms of this type? And once again, different kinds of naturalists may focus down on specific organs, or they might just speak kind of the whole organism here. Now, this may be unclear in the abstract, so here are a couple examples. In most humans, a heart serves the purpose of circulating blood throughout the body. Therefore, if a human had a condition which impaired the heart from circulating blood, that condition would constitute a disease. This is a disease because in most humans, hearts circulate blood, and in this human, something is preventing that heart from circulating that blood, or functioning normally. And circulating that blood is an essential function towards either survival, as it is, or reproduction, which, at least in part, it's still part of that process. So, because it's not common to have a heart that doesn't circulate blood well, and because circulating blood through the heart is something that's essential to living. So, more abstractly, and for those kinds of naturalists that care kind of more about including the psychological diseases as well, a typical person sleeps around 8 hours a day. Therefore, if a condition such as depression causes someone to sleep for 14 hours a day, it could be considered a disease because it's not common and functioning for a significant portion of the day or not sleeping 14 hours a day is something that at least can contribute to your survival, even if it doesn't do so as directly as a heart pumping blood. To determine if something constitutes a disease, find out if it causes individual organisms to function differently from the majority of their demographic peers, and if it's in some way important to survival or reproduction. Now, there are a range of concerns that we might have with position. Here, we're going to examine 5. First, there is the concern that abnormality is not always negative. Someone may naturally only be able to sleep 4 hours a night, but be able to function just as well as most people on 4 hours of sleep. We generally would not think of this person as having a disease, as their difference constitutes an advantage, and disease generally has that negative value judgment placed on it. However, this inability to sleep more than 4 hours constitutes an impairing to the normal functioning of sleeping 8 hours. And in general, humans, once again, we're looking at that statistical average, humans need 8 hours of sleep in order to function and survive and live their daily lives. And therefore, by the naturalist definition, it is a disease. But by our kind of general feelings about it, we'd say, no, that's great if you can only sleep 4 hours a night. You have so much more time to get things done. Without a normative judgment as to what's good or bad, the naturalist's argument cannot explain why positive abnormality is not a disease. And we'll look at the normativist position for why these kinds of things are important in a sec. Second, normal functioning may depend on a range of criteria that are quite distant from any biological explanation, such as the language that you speak. Take the neurological differences that cause dyslexia. This is a very interesting thing. The differences that cause dyslexia for an English speaker, the neurological differences in the brain of an English speaker that cause them to have dyslexia for English, would go unnoticed if that same person was a Chinese speaker. Because of the way that Chinese and English work, different brain differences cause dyslexia. So someone that's dyslexic in English may not be dyslexic in Chinese, and someone that's dyslexic in Chinese may not be dyslexic in English. So while the differences that cause a Chinese speaker to have dyslexia would not generally impair an English speaker. The question then for the naturalist is being able to speak which language constitutes normal functioning. Because if you were in a society that only spoke Chinese languages, you would never see someone that was an English dyslexic as having a disease. But we can't have a solely biological explanation of why that person doesn't have a disease and someone that is exactly genetically and physiologically identical to that person but lives in an English society does have a disease. Despite the fact that speaking and reading and writing English is while perhaps not essential skill for survival, is an important skill for perhaps reproduction and in some ways survival if you can't get a job or continue living in a society. If they claim that the biological difference which causes English dyslexia are a disease, then it's clear how these differences impair normal functioning of a Chinese speaker. Basically, you have this problem of these kind of cultural differences that may mean that something gets looked at as a disease in one culture, but not in another, with the, I think, very clear example of language here. The third objection which is raised is the question of homosexuality. The majority of humans are not homosexual, and homosexuality impedes the biological function of reproduction. In fact, the DSM classified homosexuality as a disease until 1994. That's the Diagnostic Manual for Psychologists. However, many folks in Western societies these days today claim that homosexuality is not a disease. Naturalists claim that this was a misclassification. However, it's hard to see how, as it does in fact fit the criteria that naturalism had. It's not common, it's not the statistical average, and it impedes reproduction. It is a feature of a person that will impede reproduction and isn't common. So, by their criteria, it seems to be a disease. So it seems difficult to see how the naturalist will say, oh, no, that's not actually a disease, when it seems to fit your criteria. So the point of this is not to say that homosexuality is a disease, but rather to say that if you are someone that thinks it's not, you need to rethink a naturalist position because it's going to be problematic for you. Or at least come up with a way or a specific naturalistic definition which will allow for these kind of instances. However, even if we set that issue aside, these criteria seem problematic. For example, there's evidence that humans started off with dark skin in sub-Saharan Africa, and some humans later developed lighter skin. When that trait originally emerged, lighter skin would definitely fit the classification of a disease. The normal functioning of the skin for the vast majority of humans when this mutation initially emerged was to protect humans from the sun. And as skin cancer can show, excessive exposure to the sun can lead to things like death and can prevent survival. So this mutation was harmful to survival. Therefore, lighter skin with less melanin impaired that essential function and was comparatively rare within the population at the time. Therefore, according to the naturalist definition, being white was actually a disease, which I think a lot of people are going to be intuitively concerned with. Finally, we might be concerned about the naturalistic conception due to things like contraceptives. Contraceptives, like the pill, are an environmental factor that impairs normal functioning that leads to reproduction, and they don't constitute the statistically natural functioning of individuals. However, we generally would not treat someone taking contraceptives as someone having a disease, even a kind of environmental disease like alcoholism or obesity, which is involved with the choices that an individual makes. We wouldn't consider someone that makes the choice to take contraceptives to have that kind of a disease. We would say, no, they're making a logical choice and they're using medicine to alter their body in a way that makes sense to them. So there's a lot of problems for the naturalist, despite how intuitive the idea of just getting a biological answer is. So with that, we move on to kind of the other side of the coin. This is normativism. So naturalism is often contrasted with normativism, also known as constructivism, about diseases. The normativist claims that something being a disease is a function of our values. When we place a negative value on a health condition, it is considered a disease. Disease is not a feature of how we actually function, but how a given society thinks that we should function. Instead of being specific to a type of person, as the naturalist conception was, normativism is specific to a society. So note that this is a subjective position, similar to kind of subjectivist theories of ethics, and it doesn't claim that there's some objective fact about the biological state of affairs that makes one condition a disease and another not. Rather, it's simply talking about, when we talk about diseases, we're really talking about society and how society views particular symptoms or conditions, not some deep underlying biological feature of the world. This is able to solve a number of the problems for naturalism. Sleeping only 4 hours a night is not a disease because most cultures place a positive value on it. Not being able to read English may be considered a disease in a society where English is the only language, but not one where Chinese is the only language. Different societies may consider a particular skin tone or sexual orientation as negative or positive, and may consider it a disease or merely a characteristic accordingly. Whether these things are considered diseases or not on their biological nature, but they aren't considered diseases or not based on solely their biological nature, but rather on our normative interpretations of them, the values that we place on them. Is this good? Is this bad? If it's bad, we classify it as a disease. If it's not, we don't. Now, normativism also has its critics. One criticism of any culturally subjective theory such as this is basically that we cannot judge another culture for considering something a disease, even when such a judgment is clearly ethically problematic. One example from philosophical literature is the disease of drapetomania, a commonly diagnosed disease in American slaves in the 19th century, with the principal symptom being the tendency to run away. If the culture of the time considered that a disease, the normativist is committed to the claim that the individuals in that time were correct to believe that it was a disease, because the people there thought it was a disease. While this position allows us to accept kind of traditional different cultural beliefs about disease, it also forces us to accept things like this, which is ethically problematic for a lot of people. Another common objection to this position is that there is disagreement as to whether certain conditions are diseases or not within a given culture. Alcoholism, obesity, and so on. And as long as there is some disagreement around those things, it's unclear if it's a disease or not, and it's unclear what we as a society should do about it. If society cannot agree that a particular condition is positive or negative, it's unclear whether that condition is a disease. And there's arguably more disagreement than we think in some of these issues. In line with this, conditions often may have both positive and negative characteristics. Individuals, for example, that are neuroatypical may choose not to take medication that makes them quote-unquote function normally, as they may feel that their true selves are not there when they take the medication, or that they feel more creative when they don't have the medication. A vaccine may temporarily impair some functioning, but allow immunity against a more harmful disease in the future. If a society views conditions as a mixed bag of benefits and costs, it's once again unclear whether they can be classified as a disease under the normativist framework, even though a lot of neuroatypical situations might be considered diseases, while vaccines probably wouldn't be, despite both of them being a little bit of a mixed bag. It's hard to have that kind of objective definition of what a disease is when you're being so subjective of how exactly do people agree and disagree on these kinds of things. Some have offered a third solution to this problem, which is a hybrid of the other two to resolve some of these issues. These hybrid solutions count conditions which have both a negative normative component and some biological component failing to perform its function. These approaches have the challenge of dealing with conditions like depression, where there may not be a biological component driving them, but they are often considered the kind of thing that you might want to visit a healthcare provider for, and so often would be considered, at least in that very broad category, of disease. What do you think? What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be considered a disease in that kind of broad philosophical sense of the term? Are you convinced by the naturalists, the normativists? Do you have some completely different conception of disease that you'd like to offer? Please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay skeptical, stay healthy, watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.